In 2008, in a cave in southern Siberia, someone lifted a piece of a child's finger bone out of the dirt. It was tiny, smaller than the nail on your smallest finger. It went into a bag with a number written on it, and for a while nobody thought about it again. The cave is called Denisova. It sits in the Altai Mountains in the far south of Siberia, where Russia leans in toward Mongolia and Kazakhstan and China. Cold, high, quiet country. Pine and grey stone, and a green river running below. That fragment was one small find among many thousands, and it waited its turn in a drawer. Then its Dina was read. And the reading did not come back the way anyone expected. It was not us. It was not Neanderthal either. It belonged to a kind of human being that nobody had known was there. Not a lost tribe of people like ourselves. A separate branch of the family living in those mountains, raising children in that valley. And we had walked past them for 100 years of digging without once seeing them. So let me set the mystery down in front of you now. Gently, because it will carry the whole night. We have almost nothing of these people. One finger bone, a few teeth, and a scrap or two more. That is very nearly the entire physical record of a whole kind of human. And yet their Dina is alive tonight, inside people walking around in the world. So who were they? How does an entire branch of humanity vanish so completely that only its genes survive? And why are pieces of them still inside living people? Hold those questions open in your hands. Do not close them yet. We are going to walk all the way around one small bone, slowly, and by the end of the night the answer will be sitting there, and it is stranger and warmer than you would guess. But we start where it started, in the dark, in the floor of a cave, with something almost too small to notice. Think how easily that fragment could have been missed. It is the end joint of a little finger, and not even all of it. Put it in your palm, and it would be lost there. A chip of pale bone, the colour of the earth around it, about the size of a grain of rice. In the sieve it looks like gravel. In the lamplight it looks like nothing at all. That summer's digging turned up drawers of animal bone, chips of stone, teeth, all the ordinary quiet debris of a place people used for a very long time. This went in with the rest. And it is only ever chance that keeps a thing like that. A trowel a few centimetres to the left, and it stays in the ground, a careless sieve, and it goes out with the spoil. A tired student looks away for 1 second at the wrong moment, and a whole branch of humanity stays lost. Whole peoples hang on threads that thin. I want to know where you are right now. Somewhere out there it is early morning. You might be in Berlin, with the light coming grey and soft through the window and the coffee going cold beside you. Somewhere it is the deep middle of the night. You might be in Vancouver, the street below gone quiet, one lamp still burning in the room, and somewhere it is the flat bright middle of the day. You might be in Melbourne, on a lunch break, with the long afternoon still ahead. Wherever you are, do one small thing for me. Look at your own hand. Find the last joint of your smallest finger, the little one at the very end. That is the bone. That is exactly the bone. A girl in a Siberian cave had one too, and it is very nearly all that is left of her entire people. So come back with me to that summer and stand at the edge of the trench. The cave mouth is above you, wide and dark in the hillside. Inside, the air is cool against your arms even in July. Lamps are strung along the wall. The floor has been cut down in careful steps, and the steps go down through soft grey sediment, and every layer is older than the one above it. People kneel on boards, and the trowels move in small strokes. Buckets of loose earth go out into the daylight, where the sediment is washed through mesh and picked over by hand. It is patient, unglamorous work. Nobody is hoping for a new kind of human. Nobody knows that is even possible. The fragment came out of the east chamber of the cave. That chamber is a side gallery off the main room, quiet and out of the drought, the kind of corner you would choose to sleep in. In the field notes it is nothing much. A piece of bone. Human, probably. It was catalogued and packed away with everything else. Later, in a laboratory a long way from those mountains, somebody looked at it properly and worked out what it was. The end joint of a finger, from a hand that was still growing. A child's hand, smaller than yours. A girl, most likely somewhere between 6 and 13 years old. In the records she became Denisova 3, which is a cold name for a child, and it is the only one she will ever have. A finger bone is a poor thing to be remembered by. Look at your own hand again. That end joint says almost nothing about a person. Not their height, not their face, not the colour of their hair, or whether they laughed easily. Yours and mine are near enough identical. A Neanderthal's would sit in your palm without looking strange at all. Bone shape, in a piece that small, is close to silent, which is exactly why nobody hurried. There was no reason on earth to think this chip of finger would rearrange the human family tree. I want to be careful here, because it is easy to talk about her as a specimen. She was not a specimen. She was a child in a cold place, with a family around her, and a mother whose face she knew. She had learned the smell of wood smoke and the sound of that river. She would have had a name, in a language you will never hear, and somebody used it every single day. Somebody carried her, and fed her, and worried about her, and taught her which way the weather comes over that ridge. We know none of it. None of it reaches you across that distance, and it never will. We only know that she was there, and that a small part of her stayed behind after everything else was gone. Try to hold her as a person and not a number, because the rest of the night is easier if you do. So the bone waited. It sat in its bag, catalogued, boxed, shelved, the way 10,000 other fragments are sitting tonight in museum drawers, in cities you have walked through. Stay with that a moment, because it changes what you think discovery is. The find was not the moment of discovery. The find was only the moment the bone stopped being lost. What mattered was a decision, taken later, to spend real time and real money on an unpromising scrap, and it is often like that. Not a shout in a trench, a quiet choice about which small thing to look at properly. Most of the deep past is lying in a drawer somewhere, waiting for somebody to become curious about it. Eventually the fragment travelled. Part of it went west, to a laboratory in Leipzig in Germany, where a group of people had spent years learning to pull Dina out of things that should not have any left. Ancient Dina is broken and scarce, and easily swamped by the Dina of the living. Reading it is closer to salvage than to reading. Picture the room if you like. White benches, filtered air, gloves and masks, because your own DNA on a fingertip would drown hers in an instant. A little of the bone had to be ground down and dissolved to reach it, which sounds like a loss, and in a way it was. How they did that, and what happened in the room when the first results came up, I am saving for later tonight. Let the machines run quietly in the background for now. Think for a moment about what this means. because we had never done it in this order before. Every other kind of ancient human we know we met face first. A skull came out of a quarry, or a bone out of a riverbank, and we looked at the shape and said, "This is somebody new." You knew what a Neanderthal looked like long before anyone could read a single letter of their code. Here it ran the other way round. A people were found in their genes, and only afterwards did anyone go looking for their bodies. And the bodies, when we went looking, were barely there. Sit with the oddness of that. There is a kind of human you can read, but cannot see. You can learn about their health, their families, the long journeys they made across a continent. You cannot picture a single one of them standing in a doorway. Every other people of the deep past we know as bodies first and stories second. These are the other way round. They are almost pure information. A rumour written in chemistry, held in a few grams of bone, and in the cells of people alive today. That is the part that stays with me. We can tell you about their immune systems. We can tell you something about their family lines and where they travelled. We cannot tell you the shape of their faces. Not really. There is no whole skull to lift and turn in the light. There is no skeleton laid out in order on a table. There is a small handful of fragments and an enormous amount of information, and the two do not match. Other pieces will come into this story later from other places, and I will name them when their turn comes. Which brings us back to the thing we cannot yet explain. A people left a rich, detailed, readable record of themselves inside living human beings, and almost no trace at all in the ground. That is backwards, and you should feel how backwards it is. Bodies are the loud part of the past. Genes are the quiet part. Here the quiet part survived, and the loud part did not. Before we can go anywhere near an answer, you need to know the place. The cave is not simply where the bone turned up. The cave is one of the strangest things in the whole story. So let the trench go dark behind us. Come up out of the valley with me, into the mountains, and look at where these people chose to live. The Altai Mountains sit almost exactly in the middle of Asia. If you look at a map and find the point furthest from any sea, it is near there. Russia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia and China all come together in that high country, in ridges of grey rock and long green valleys. There are larch and pine on the slopes. There are meadows that turn gold in the autumn. The rivers run fast and cold and very clear. Winters are hard and long, and the summers are short and bright and full of insects, and the light stays late. It is a crossing place, and it always has been, with open ground running north into Siberia and south toward the deserts and the far mountains beyond them. Down in one of those valleys runs a river called the Denny. It is not a large river, and it moves quickly over stones, pale green in summer, frozen at its edges by October. The valley is broad enough to walk in, with birch on the slopes and outcrops of limestone standing out of the trees. The limestone is the important part. Water has been working through that rock for an immense length of time, dissolving it, opening it, hollowing out rooms inside the hills. That is how you get caves. Not one cave, dozens of them, all through that country. Come up the slope with me. It is a short climb from the river, steeper than it looks, through grass and loose stone. About 28 metres up, the hillside opens. There is a broad arch of rock, higher than a doorway, wider than a room. Even outside it you can feel the air change. Caves breathe. In summer the breath is cool and comes out to meet you. In winter it runs the other way, and the cave is the warmer place. Stand in the mouth and look back down. You can see the river. You can see anything moving in that valley for a long way in both directions. Now turn and go in. The main chamber is not small, and the floor of the whole cave runs to something near 300 square meters, about the size of a decent house. There is an opening high in the roof where daylight falls straight down in a soft column, and dust turns slowly inside it. Galleries lead off to the sides, into the dark. The rock is dry underfoot. The wind cannot reach you here, and neither can the rain, and the temperature barely moves all year. Try to feel a winter in that place. Outside, the valley is white, and the river runs black under ice at its edges. The cold in that country goes far below anything most people have ever stood in. Inside the cave the air is still. It is not warm. It is survivable, and the distance between those two words is the distance between a people continuing and a people ending. A fire against the back wall throws light up the rock. The smoke finds the opening in the roof and goes. You are sitting on ground that other people sat on, though you have no way of knowing it. The cave carries a name from much nearer our own time. In the 1700s, the story goes, a hermit lived in it. His name was Denny, and people in the valley began calling the place after him. Denisova, the Cave of Denny. There is an older name too, in the language of the Altai, and it means bare rock. So the shelter that gave up a whole lost kind of human is named for a holy man who slept there a few centuries ago. The deep past leaves the naming to whoever turns up last. Now look down, because the floor is the reason we are here. A cave floor is not the ground. It is a slow pile-up of everything that ever happened in the room. Dust blows in and settles, and flakes drop off the ceiling. Fires burn down to ash, and the ash is trodden flat. Animals come in and leave bones behind, people chip stone, and lose things and sweep the mess toward the wall. Then water works down through the rock. The whole lot compacts, and the next year begins on top of it. Do that for 100,000 years and you get depth. Real depth. In Denisova Cave, the deposits run down for meters. In bands you can see with the naked eye, one lying on the next like pages left flat on a desk. The band at the bottom is the oldest. The band at the top is the youngest. That is the whole principle, and it is beautifully simple. Time in that cave does not run along a line. It runs downward, into the floor, under your feet. So an excavation is really a kind of reading. You take the floor apart from the top, slowly, one thin band at a time, and each band is a slab of time with things caught in it. A hearth, a scatter of stone tools, and charcoal that can be dated. Animal bones that tell you what the weather was doing, because the animals change when the climate changes. Cold country creatures in one layer, woodland creatures in the layer above. It is a diary kept by people who had no intention of keeping one. If you knelt beside one of those bands and took a pinch of it between your fingers, it would feel like nothing much. Cool, fine, faintly gritty, and a soft grey-brown. There is charcoal in it too small to see, and pollen, and bone dust, and stone chips like coarse sand. It would sit in your palm looking like dirt. It is not dirt. It is a compressed afternoon. It is somebody's winter, and somebody's fire, and the ash of a meal pressed flat by everything that came after. I should be honest with you about how hard that reading is. Cave floors do not stay tidy. Burrowing animals push material up and down. Water moves fine grains through the deposit. Feet trample. Ice lifts. roof falls crush. A layer can be disturbed in ways that are hard to see even when you are kneeling in it. That is why the dates from this cave have been argued over for years, carefully and in public, and why some have moved as the methods improved. That is not a weakness. That is what honest work sounds like. Every date you hear tonight is the best reading of a difficult page offered by people who would say exactly that themselves. And here is the thing that makes this one cave unlike anywhere else on Earth. Denisovans were in it. Neanderthals were in it. Modern humans, people like you, were in it too. 3 kinds of human, in the same hillside, in the same valley, across tens of thousands of years. Not all at once, and mostly not in the same lifetime, but in that one arch of rock, in turn, again and again. There is no other place known with a record like it. 1 address. 3 peoples. Take a moment with that scale, because the numbers slide off the mind. The deposits in that cave reach back further than our own species has existed. Near the bottom there is material older than 300,000 years. A family shelters there. Then nobody, for longer than all of recorded history. Put yourself down inside that gap for a second, and the mind simply refuses the size of it. Then hyenas den in the same corner. Then another family of another kind of human entirely, who never knew the first one existed. The fire is lit in roughly the same place, because that is where the draught works. Some corners are simply the good corners. Stand in the middle of that chamber in your mind and let the years run. Imagine you could hold still there for 200,000 years. The column of light through the roof swings and swings. Outside, the forest advances and retreats as the world cools and warms. Ice comes closer, then draws back to the north. And every so often, in the dark behind you, there is a fire and low voices, and somebody asleep against the wall. The voices are not always speaking the same kind of language. They are not always coming from the same kind of person. The cave does not mind. It holds whoever is in it. Between the human stays, the cave belonged to animals. Hyenas used it, and wolves, and bears, and they dragged bones in and left them. Some of the bone in that floor was carried in by animals, and some by people, and telling one from the other is a skill in itself. The cave was never only a human place, and for most of its long life nobody human was inside it at all. Tens of thousands of fragments have come out of that sediment. Almost every one of them is animal. That is normal. Human bone is always the rarest thing in a cave, and it is worth holding on to when you hear how little we have of these people. The floor has also given up things that stop people where they stand. A bracelet of dark polished stone, with a hole drilled clean through it, worked so finely that when it was first shown many people simply did not believe the age of it. A needle made of bone, slim and straight, with an eye at one end, long enough to sew a fitted coat. Beautiful work. Careful work. Made by whose hands exactly is argued over, and the arguments turn on the layers we have just been talking about. The people who dug those objects out were not hunting for a controversy, and they published what they had and let the argument happen. I am not going to pretend that is settled tonight. You should have the honest version. Ask yourself why they all kept coming back. It stops being mysterious once you are standing in the mouth of the place. You are dry. You are out of the wind. You are above the river and close to it. You can see game moving below, and anything approaching, long before it arrives. The stone in that country is good for making tools, and the forest gives fuel. A cave like that is not a hole in a hill. It is the best house in the district, and it stayed the best house for 250,000 years. Which brings us back, gently, to the thing we still cannot explain. This is a generous site, dug with great care for decades. It has given up hundreds of thousands of objects, and out of all of that, the people whose name it now carries left us a finger bone, a few teeth, and a scrap or two more. They were there for an immense stretch of time. They left almost nothing of themselves in the ground. Everything else we know about them had to come out of that powder, out of the code, on a laboratory bench a long way west of the Altai. So that is where you and I go next, down into the bone, into the broken alphabet inside it, and into the day the reading came back and matched nobody at all. So the fragment leaves the mountain. It is bagged and labelled and carried down out of the valley. Then it goes west, a long way west, much further than its owner is ever likely to have travelled. It ends in a laboratory in Leipzig, in Germany, and there it waits its turn in a drawer among other small brown pieces of bone from other places. You should know what is inside it, or rather, what might be. Here is what you have to understand before the rest of this makes sense. That Dina should not be there at all, not after so long. Ancient Dina is not simply an old find, the way an old pot is a pot that happened to last. It is closer to pulling readable ink off paper that has sat at the bottom of a river since before your language existed. Everything in the chemistry says it should be gone by now. Almost always, it is. Dina is a long molecule, and it is not built to last. From the moment a body stops living, it begins to come apart. Water breaks the chain, warmth speeds that up. Bacteria and fungi arrive and take what they can use, and oxygen does its own slow work on whatever is left over. In most of the world, after a few thousand years, there is nothing readable at all. A bone becomes a shape. Then the shape becomes soil. Cold is different. Cold is very nearly a kindness. The cave you have been standing in holds itself at almost one temperature all year. Dark, still, cool to just above freezing. Nothing in there is preserved perfectly, because nothing anywhere is, but it is held. And holding, as it turns out, is enough. If you set out to build a place for keeping fragile things, you would build something very like that cave, cool and even, out of the sun and out of the wind. A floor that rises slowly and covers over what lies on it. No real summer heat, no thaw and freeze and thaw again, working away at everything year after year. Nothing much to disturb what has already settled. There is a second kindness, and it is inside the bone itself. Bone is not only living tissue, it is also mineral, a dense crystal scaffolding, and broken pieces of dinar bind to that mineral and shelter inside it. So the small bone in your imagination is also a small stone safe. It has been keeping something for tens of thousands of years without ever being asked to. Something survives. Not much. Not a strand. What survives is confetti. Picture a book of 3 billion letters, torn up, most of it gone, and the remainder scattered as scraps of 30 to 50 letters each. That is the working material. Short, jumbled, and chemically bruised. At the broken ends of every scrap, certain letters have quietly changed into other letters, in a pattern that only very old Dina shows. That damage is a gift. It is how you tell true ancient Dina from a modern smudge. And the smudge is the real enemy in this work. You are made of the same molecule that is being hunted. So is everyone who has touched that bone since it came out of the ground. and everyone who breathed near it, and everyone who made the plastic tube it now sits in. Picture the room where this is done. The air inside is pushed gently outward so that nothing drifts in from the corridor. Overnight, the lamps burn ultraviolet across every surface. There are 2 pairs of gloves, a hood, a mask, a suit that covers the shoes. There is a changing room and a rule about direction. You move from the clean side toward the ordinary world and never back the other way in the same day. Some laboratories keep the whole operation in a separate building. Some do the delicate steps at night when the corridors are empty. Put yourself in the doorway of it for a moment. Ordinary clothes stay behind in the outer room. Hair, mouth, hands and shoes all get covered over. Every surface you would touch has been wiped down and then burned clean by light, and the tools have had the same treatment. Even the water and the chemicals get checked, because a sealed bottle can carry traces of somebody who never set foot in the building. Everything is done slowly, and as little as possible is touched. The person working in there is trying very hard not to end up in the answer. Then comes the part that is difficult to watch. To read the bone, you have to take some of the bone. A slow drill, turning gently so it does not warm the material, lifts away a small cone of powder. A few tens of milligrams, less than a pinch of salt. It sounds like nothing, and on a fragment that size it is not nothing at all. Somebody has to decide that this is worth it. Somebody signs for that. Think about the size of that decision for a second. There is not much of this bone, and there is no more of it anywhere in the world. Whatever you take, you do not get back. If the method fails, or the material turns out to be too far gone, you have spent part of an irreplaceable thing and received nothing for it. So the amounts are kept small, and as much as possible is held in reserve, because better methods have a habit of arriving later. Some fragments have been sampled 2 or 3 times across the years, a little at a time, as the tools got quietly better. The powder goes into solution, and what comes back out is mostly not the girl, it is soil. It is bacteria that lived in the sediment long after she did, and fungi, and the ordinary crowded life of a cave floor. In a good sample, the human portion might be a few %. In a poor one, far less than that. Everything else has to be recognized and set aside before you can even begin. The surviving scraps are then given tiny molecular handles, copied, and fed into a machine that reads millions of short pieces at once. A computer takes each piece and asks where it would sit in a known human genome. Most pieces are bacteria and get discarded. The rest slowly stack up, position by position, until the same spot has been read over and over and the errors average out. That repetition is the whole trick. Any single scrap is unreliable on its own, because it is short and damaged and might have come from anywhere. 30 scraps covering the same stretch, all agreeing with each other, are something else entirely. Confidence here is never built out of one perfect reading. It is built out of a great many poor ones, stacked patiently until the noise cancels itself and a letter emerges that you can actually trust. This is not one dramatic moment at a microscope. It is months of quiet, careful, unglamorous work by a lot of people. They started with the easiest target. Inside every one of your cells, and every one of hers, there are mitochondria, hundreds of them, and each carries its own small loop of DNA, about 16,500 letters long. Because there are so many copies per cell, mitochondrial DNA survives in far better numbers than the rest. If anything at all is going to come back, it is that. And even then, usually, nothing does. For every fragment that gives up a readable sequence, a great many give up nothing usable. The bone was too warm or too wet, or was washed or handled, or simply lay in the wrong kind of soil for too long. Whole sites have produced silence. You never hear about those, because there is nothing to say about them. Every success you do hear about is a survivor of a long, patient run of failures. In 2010, it came back. Now, there were two expected answers, and by this point you can probably name both of them. The bone might be a modern human, one of the people who used that valley later, or it might be a Neanderthal, because Neanderthals had certainly lived there. Those were the options. A cave in southern Siberia in that period had two kinds of people in it. The sequence matched neither. It was not a near miss either, lined up against us and against the Neanderthals. This mitochondrial line ran back roughly twice as deep as theirs does, something on the order of 1 million years of separation. A branch nobody had drawn, on a tree everybody thought they had finished. The first response to a result like that is not celebration. It is suspicion. You assume you have made a mistake, because a mistake is far more likely than a new kind of human. So they went back and took a second sample and ran it again from the beginning, and the answer did not move. You can imagine how that first stretch of weeks must have felt. Not triumph. A quiet, uncomfortable sense that something has gone wrong somewhere and you have not yet found where. They checked the samples and they checked the chemicals. They checked the people, comparing the strange sequence against the sequences of everyone who had handled that bone, in case somebody in the building was the answer. Nobody was. And the pattern of chemical damage sat exactly where it should sit, at the ends of the fragments in the right proportions, which is what genuinely old material looks like, and what a fresh smudge never does. Still with me? Good. Stay close for this next part, wherever you are, because this is where the whole thing turns. Later that same year, working from the same speck of powder, they managed something harder, not just the little loop, but the main genome, the one held in the nucleus, the long one. And that told a fuller story. These people were a sister group to the Neanderthals. The two of them shared an ancestor with each other more recently than either of them shared one with you, and then, a very long time ago, they parted and went their separate ways. The two readings did not agree perfectly, and that mismatch is itself a clue. Hold on to it, because it becomes useful much later. Sit quietly with what had just happened, though, because it had never happened before. For as long as we have been naming our relatives, they have arrived face first. Somebody lifts a skull out of a quarry or a riverbank. It goes on a table under a lamp. It is measured, drawn, argued over, compared with every other skull, and eventually given a formal name in a journal. The bones come first, always. The bones are the evidence, and everything else follows them. There is even a formal requirement built into the practice. To name a new species properly, you are supposed to designate a type specimen, one physical individual kept somewhere that anybody can travel to and examine for themselves. It is the anchor the name is tied to. Every argument afterwards comes back to that one object on that one shelf, and you can go and look at it, and so can the person who disagrees with you. It is a good rule. It has kept the whole field honest for a very long time. Here there were no bones to speak of. There was a sequence. A whole kind of human had been identified from its chemistry, before anyone had the faintest idea what its face looked like. and because the usual requirements could not be met, no formal species name was given. There was nothing to hold up and describe. So they were called after the cave, after the hermit the cave is named for, and that informal name is the one that stuck. Think about that for a moment. A people named after an address, not after a shape, not after a skull in a case, but after the one room we can prove they were in. That has never quite been settled since. Formal names have been proposed, and there are careful people who will not use any of them yet, on the grounds that we still do not have enough of a body to describe properly. So the informal word does all the work. It turns up in journals and in textbooks and on museum labels, and it is the only name you or anyone else is ever likely to hear. A people known by a place, because there is no face to name them for. Which brings you back to the thing we still cannot explain. Their line is old, and it is real, and it is measurable to the letter, and yet almost nothing of their bodies has ever been found, while pieces of them are alive in living people today. We can read them, we cannot see them. So let me put everything we have into your hands, because it will not take long. Here it is. One small fragment of a finger bone, from a young girl. A few teeth. A piece of skull, not a skull, a piece of one, about the size of a large coin, and a scatter of unremarkable scraps, picked out later from thousands of others, recognized not by their shape but by their chemistry. That is the collection. That is a whole kind of human being. Hold out your hand and look at it, wherever you happen to be lying. The fragment of finger is smaller than the last joint of your smallest finger, and it is not even a whole joint. The piece of skull would lie flat in your palm without reaching the edges. The teeth would roll around loose in there, with room to spare. And that is the whole physical record of an entire branch of the human family. Most of it could be lost in a coat pocket. Laid out on a table under a lamp, it would look like the contents of a drawer nobody has tidied. And a stranger walking past would not look twice. Set that beside what we have of the Neanderthals. Hundreds of individuals across Europe and Western Asia. Skulls complete enough to turn over and look straight into. Ribs, hips, feet, hands, a child's jaw, a shoulder with an old healed injury. Enough to argue about how they walked, how they breathed, how they grew from infancy. This is not a statement about which people mattered. It is a statement about luck, and about water, and about which soils eat bone and which soils do not. The teeth are worth pausing on quietly, because they are the strangest thing in that box. 2 adult molars and a child's milk tooth. They are large. Not slightly large, noticeably, memorably large, with long splayed roots, closer in size to much older relatives of ours than to anyone walking around now. And here is where you have to be careful. And honest. Large teeth tell you that they had large teeth. That is genuinely all. They do not tell you the width of a face, or the line of a brow, or the shape of a nose. You cannot grow a person outward from a molar, so there is a long, quiet list of things nobody can tell you. We do not know how tall they stood. We do not know whether they were heavy or slight, wide-shouldered or narrow. We do not know the colour of their skin, or their hair, or their eyes, with anything close to certainty. We do not know their voices. We do not know whether they spoke as we speak, and we should be very slow to assume they did not, because we have no way at all to check. We do not know how they carried their children, or how they settled themselves through the long cold dark of a Siberian winter, or what they called that valley among themselves. They certainly called it something. There has been one clever attempt at a face. Chemical marks sit on top of dinar, switching parts of it on and off. And some of those patterns tend to travel with particular skeletal traits. Read the patterns, and you can predict the traits. Done for these people, it suggested a wide skull, a broad face, a large dental arch, and no chin of the kind you have. But you must hear that for what it is. That is a portrait drawn from a formula, not from a photograph. Where fragments existed to check it against, some of the predictions held up well, which is encouraging and not the same as knowing. It is a very good guess wearing a face. Nobody has seen them. It helps to be clear about what these two kinds of evidence actually do, because they are not the same tool at all. A genome answers questions about descent. Where a people sits on the family tree, who their ancestors were, and who those ancestors met along the way, and which versions of which genes they carried and handed on. It is a quiet record of relationship, and it reaches back further than anything else we have. A skeleton answers something completely different, because a skeleton is a biography. It tells you how tall somebody stood, and how heavy, and what work they did, because hard use thickens bone in particular places and leaves the marks where you can read them. It shows an arm broken and healed, which also tells you that somebody looked after them while it mended. It shows illness and hunger and season after season of slow ordinary living. It can tell you roughly how old a person was on their last day. So we have their descent in extraordinary detail. We have almost none of their lives. You can trace their family line back across several 100,000 years, letter by letter, and still not say what any single one of them did on any single afternoon. There is a similar honesty required about the things found in that cave. Objects came out of those layers, some of them fine, some of them made with real skill. Whose hands made them is argued over, and the argument is not settled, because flaws like that get stirred, and dates like those are hard. There are confident claims in both directions. The careful answer is that we do not yet know. Strangest of all, they can be found in places where no bone is left. Take a handful of sediment from the cave floor, in the right layer, and there is human DNA in the dirt itself. Shed, worn away, soaked in, and still legible after all this time. A presence with no body attached to it. The floor held on to them long after their bones were gone. So what does a species look like when it is very nearly invisible? It looks like this. You have their inheritance in enormous detail, letter by letter, better than any written record of any ancient people. You can say things about them that they could never have known about themselves, and you could not pick one of them out of a crowded room. You would walk straight past, we have the whole recipe and none of the meal. Or think of it as knowing a song by its sheet music and never once hearing it sung. Every note is there in front of you, exact and complete and in the right order. The sound is gone. You can say precisely what it would have been. You cannot say what it was. That is a genuinely odd place to stand, and it is worth standing there quietly rather than hurrying past it. Because it is easy, with so little in front of us, to let them thin out into an idea. A data point, a branch on a diagram, a shaded band on a chart. They were not that. They had faces, every one of them. Faces that somebody else knew perfectly well, and could pick out at a distance by the way they walked. Somebody looked at that child's small hand and knew it as well as you know the hands of the people you love. The silence in the record is a fact about limestone and water and time. It is not a fact about them, and it helps to remember how thin the record is for very nearly everybody. Think of all the people who have ever lived, and then think how few have left behind any trace at all that lasts. For most of human time, the ordinary outcome is complete disappearance. What is strange about these particular people is not that their bones are missing. That part is entirely normal. What is strange is that we found them anyway, through a door nobody knew was in the wall. The bones are missing for ordinary reasons, and knowing them helps. Bone needs luck to last. It needs cold and shelter and a soil that will not dissolve it, and then it needs somebody to come along and look. Caves give you all of that. Open ground gives you almost none of it. A people spread thin across a wide landscape, living mostly outdoors, will leave a scatter so faint that finding it comes close to chance. Acid soils dissolve bone within a few centuries. Rain moves what is left, animals move it, roots work into it and break it apart. Something left in the open in a forest is gone. Entirely gone, within a lifetime or two of your own. Even inside a cave, what tends to last is the dense material, the teeth and the thicker pieces, which is exactly what is sitting in front of you now. And then somebody has to be digging in that 1 square metre, in that one layer, on that one afternoon, and has to notice. And here is the part that ought to sit warmly with you tonight. Some of their bones have very probably already been found. They are sitting in trays and drawers in museums and university basements, catalogued as fragments, unidentifiable by shape, waiting quietly for somebody with the right method and enough patience. The next one may not be dug up at all. It may be recognized on a shelf. One of them already was, in a sense, and it was not found in Siberia. It came from somewhere much higher and very far to the south, and it changes the size of the map entirely. We will come to it soon. For now, let it stay where it is. A cave in the Altai, the cold coming up out of the dark. A few small pieces on a table under a lamp. A whole people we can read letter by letter and have never once seen. Their line is real, their faces are gone, and somehow, impossibly, they are not finished yet. So the map changes now, and it changes because of a broken piece of jaw. The right side of a lower jaw snapped across the front, with 2 large molars still seated firmly in the bone. That is the whole object. It would sit in one palm with a good deal of room left over, and it is the reason everything you have understood so far about where these people lived is about to become much too small. I want to take you a long way from Siberia. Keep the Altai in mind a moment longer. The river valley, the dark opening in the limestone, and the cold that comes up out of the ground, even in the middle of summer. Hold that gently, and then lift out of it and travel south and east, across a great deal of quiet country. Grassland gives way to gravel, and gravel gives way to bare stone, and then the land begins to rise and simply does not stop rising. Now you are on the edge of the Tibetan Plateau. The place is called Siahe, and there is a river running through the valley below it, and grasslands the colour of old rope in the autumn. Above the grass there stands a pale limestone cliff with a dark opening set high in its face. Behind that opening a cave runs back into the rock much further than anyone would guess from outside. Bayshia Karst Cave. It sits about 3,280 metres above sea level. I want to give you the feel of that number, because the number on its own will not do it. Stand at the mouth of it with me for a minute. The first thing you notice up there is not the view, and it is not the enormous silence either. It is your own breathing. Every breath you draw at that height carries roughly a third less oxygen than the same breath taken down at the level of the sea. Nothing hurts. You simply find that all the ordinary business of being alive has quietly become slower. Walking uphill turns into an act of deliberate attention. Bending down to pick something up leaves you standing afterward with your hands on your knees, waiting for the world to settle back into place. People who go up there for the first time describe it not as pain, but as a strange, patient heaviness that follows them around for days. Let your shoulders drop while I tell you the rest of it. The wind at that height has no obstacles left to soften it, so it arrives the way water arrives, steady and without pause. The sun is fierce and gives almost no warmth, which means a person can be sunburnt and cold within the same single hour. Winter nights fall far below freezing and then stay there for months at a stretch. There are no trees to speak of, and therefore very little firewood, and the growing season is short and grudging when it comes at all. And people lived there. Not visitors, not a summer party that walked up once, looked around at the view, and hurried back down to easier country before the weather turned. People, settled into the place, returning to it, working in it, raising children in it. That is what the jawbone did. It lifted the Denisovans out of one Siberian valley and set them down on the roof of the world. And it managed all of that without a single readable strand of DNA. Let me tell you how it reached us, because the route is lovely and slightly improbable. The cave is a holy place and has been for a very long time. It is a Buddhist sanctuary and pilgrims still make the walk up to it. In 1980, a monk inside that cave found the piece of jaw lying where it had lain for longer than any person could reasonably imagine. He did not throw it away, and he did not keep it as a curiosity on a shelf. He carried it out and gave it to the 6th Gungthang living Buddha, who kept it safe, and eventually passed it along to scholars at Lanzhou University. And there it sat. For the better part of 40 years, one of the most important human fossils on Earth lay in a drawer in a university collection. Nobody alive could say what it was. That happens more often than you would think. The tools needed to read it had not been invented yet, so it waited, unhurried, the way things in drawers do. When researchers finally turned their full attention to it, they walked straight into a problem. The Altai finger bone had given up its DNA because Siberian cave floors are cold and stable. Cold is exactly what ancient genetic material needs in order to survive at all. Xiaohe was a very different proposition. The jaw was far older, and warm seasons and moving water had been working on it for an extremely long time. When they went looking for genetic material, there was essentially none left in it, nothing to sequence, nothing you could line up against anything else, so they read the proteins instead. Here is the idea, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is one of the quietly beautiful pieces of thinking in this whole story. Your genes are the instructions, and proteins are the things the instructions build. Collagen is a protein, and collagen is the flexible scaffolding inside every bone in your body, and collagen is remarkably tough. It can hang on for hundreds of thousands of years in conditions that would erase DNA completely and leave you nothing at all to read. A protein is a chain of amino acids strung one after another, like beads on a thread. The order of those beads is written directly by the gene that made them. So if you can read the order of the beads, you are reading a faint and very patient echo of the gene itself. And different kinds of humans spell their collagen slightly differently, not dramatically. A bead here, a bead there. But the differences are consistent, and they are inherited down the generations. With enough of the chain laid out in front of you, it becomes possible to say which family that particular spelling belongs to. So they dissolved a small sample, sorted the fragments by weight, and read the order out of it. Think of it as reading a word when you have lost the page it was printed on. I would like you to picture what that result actually looked like on a screen. A short sequence of letters, no skull, no face, no grave, no tools laid carefully beside a body, none of the things that would normally tell you who somebody was. Just the spelling of a protein held safe inside bone for longer than our own species has existed. And the spelling was not ours. It was not Neanderthal either. In every place where the three lineages differ from one another, the Jahi jaw sided, again and again and again, with that one small Siberian finger bone. A Denisovan. On the Tibetan Plateau. Identified by chemistry rather than by genetics, they dated it using the hard carbonate crust that had grown slowly over the bone while it lay in the cave. It is the same mineral skin you will see building on the walls of any limestone cavern. That crust could not possibly be younger than the bone underneath it, so whatever age the crust gave back was a floor and not a ceiling. The crust came back at about 160,000 years old. Sit with that number for a breath. That is very much older than the finger bone down in Siberia. It means that long before the little girl in the Altai was ever born, her people were already up on the high plateau, already breathing that thin air, already coming back to that white cliff, season after season. Not passing through it, established in it, and there was a good deal more still to come. Once you know for certain that a cave held someone, you can begin questioning the floor itself. Researchers went back and lifted the sediment out in careful measured layers. Then they pulled genetic material straight from the dirt itself, from the microscopic traces that any living body leaves behind in the ground where it sleeps. The dirt gave up Denisovan DNA, and not merely once. It turned up in several separate layers, spread right across tens of thousands of years of occupation. Later, somebody working patiently through the animal bones from that same cave found a rib that did not belong to an animal. Proteins again. Denisovan again, and this time from a far later stretch of time, long after that first jaw had been laid down in the dark. So the picture stops being one lost traveller who wandered too high and never came back down. It becomes an address, generation after generation, at 3¼ kilometres above the sea, a place where a fire is hard to build and a winter is long and honest. They hunted the animals that live at that height, the wild sheep and the big grazing herds. They worked stone into the shapes they needed. They came back to the same sheltered opening in the same pale cliff, again and again. They did it across a span of time so long that it makes the whole of our recorded history look like a single quiet afternoon. Now take a step back with me and look at what you are actually holding. One cave in southern Siberia, one cave on the Tibetan Plateau. Between the two of them lie thousands of kilometres of mountain and desert and forest and grassland, and between the two of them, the same people. That is a range which stands honest comparison with the entire spread of the Neanderthals across Europe and Western Asia, and we are reading all of it from a fingertip and a broken jaw. Said plainly, it sounds almost unserious. A handful of scraps out of 2 caves, and from them a territory you could not walk across in a year of walking, which leaves one very obvious question hanging in the cold air above that cliff. How did they breathe up there? because thin air is not a matter of willpower, and no amount of determination changes what your blood is able to carry. Bodies that are not built for altitude struggle up there in specific and measurable ways. The people who live well on that plateau today are not simply hardier than everybody else. Something inside them is genuinely different. There is an answer to this. It is one of the strangest and warmest turns in the entire story, and it is waiting for us a little further along the road. I am going to make you hold on to it a while, and holding it brings us back around to the thing we still cannot explain. A splinter of a child's finger dropped into a bag, almost entirely unremarked. A whole kind of human that nobody knew had ever existed, named from its genes before anyone had ever seen its face. Almost no bones anywhere in the world. And yet pieces of these people are alive right now. They are inside people who are awake somewhere on this planet at this very moment, going about a completely ordinary day. So who were they? How does a whole kind of human vanish so thoroughly that only the genes survive? And why are those genes still inside us? Keep that question open, and keep it comfortable. We are getting closer to it than you might think. Because the next thing I want to tell you about is not a place at all. It is a girl. Come back to the Alto with me now, down off the plateau, back to the river valley, back into the cave with its 3 chambers and the cold rising steadily up out of the floor. This is where the finger bone came from. It is also where this next piece was found, and the two of them are separated by nothing at all but dirt and time. Now I want you to picture the least glamorous room in this entire story. It is not the cave. It is a laboratory bench somewhere, with good light and a long table, and on the table there are trays. In the trays there are bone fragments, thousands of them, and then tens of thousands. Splinters the size of a fingernail clipping, or a grain of rice, brown and grey and broken far past all recognition. Nothing in that tray would mean a single thing to you at a glance. This is what most of a cave floor actually produces. Not skulls. Not skeletons laid out in careful arrangement waiting to be photographed. Rubble, mostly. Bones smashed by time and weather and animals, until nothing left in the tray has a shape you could put a name to. For most of the history of this science, those trays were the end of the road. If you cannot see what a fragment is, then you cannot study it. So boxes of unidentifiable scrap sit in storerooms all over the world, going quietly unread year after year after year. Then somebody worked out how to read them anyway, and you already know the trick, because you met it up on the plateau. The method uses the same durable protein I described to you a few minutes ago. You take a fleck off a fragment, considerably less than you would lose trimming a fingernail, and you draw the collagen out of it. Collagen differs from animal to animal, so a horse spells it one way, a deer spells it another, a cave bear another again. And a human, of any kind at all, spells it differently from every one of them. So what comes back is a signature you can actually use. A short pattern, quick to read, and cheap enough to run over and over and over again. It does not tell you which kind of human. It only tells you human. And that turns out to be plenty, because it converts an unreadable tray of rubble into a search that a patient person can actually finish. And that is exactly what a young researcher sat down and did. Bag after bag, fragment after fragment. Bear, deer, horse, unknown, bear, hour upon hour of results that were not the thing she was looking for. That is what almost all real discovery honestly feels like from the inside. It is also precisely why so few people ever reach the end of a job like that one. Then one fragment came back human. It was a splinter of a long bone, an arm or a leg, about 2.5 centimetres long. Nothing whatsoever about it looked like anything at all. If it were lying on your palm right now, you would take it for a bit of kindling and think nothing more about it. They gave it a catalogue number, Denisova 11, and sent it onward to have its genome read. Most likely they expected to add one more Neanderthal or one more Denisovan to a very short list. That is not what came back. The result made no sense at all to begin with, and I want you to feel the shape of the problem, because it is a good one. When they compared the genome against Neanderthals, about half of it matched beautifully. When they compared it against Denisovans, about half of it matched beautifully. Not the same half. The obvious explanation was contamination. 2 samples mixed together, a mistake somewhere on the bench, a tube labelled wrongly on a long afternoon. That is the dull answer, and a good scientist reaches for the dull answer first, exactly as you would, and then works very hard to make it stick. It would not stick. That is the moment you would want to have been in the room for. They ran it again, and then they ran it again after that. They walked the chromosomes one region at a time. The pattern held everywhere, cleanly, in precisely the way it ought to hold if it were genuinely real. Half of this person's genome had come from one parent and half from the other, exactly as it does in every one of us. And the 2 parents had not been the same kind of human. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan. Not a distant echo of mixing many generations back, and not a faint statistical trace teased out of the noise. First generation. She was the daughter of 2 peoples who had been separate from one another for something on the order of 300, 00 dawned years. And she was the first individual of that kind anybody had ever found, in any species, anywhere in the whole fossil record. The team who read her called her Denny. I want to slow right down here, because this is the part that matters most. It is very easy to talk about a person as though she were a result on a page. She was a girl. From the thickness of the bone, she was at least 13 years old. She lived in that valley something like 90,000 years ago. She had a mother who carried her and fed her and knew the sound of her voice from across a dark room. She had a father as well. And when you read further back into his genome, his own family had a Neanderthal somewhere in it too, several hundred generations behind him. So she was not a curiosity to the people who lived around her. That is the part I would like you to keep hold of. There is a way of telling this story that makes her sound like an event, a collision, 2 species meeting at some dramatic frontier with drums behind it. I do not believe for a moment that is what it was. I think it was a family, in a valley, in the ordinary weather of an ordinary life. A child who was carried and fed and grew. A child who was known by name, or by whatever a name was to them. Her mother's people, as it happens, were more closely related to Neanderthals living far away to the west. Closer to them than to the Neanderthals who had used that very same cave in an earlier age. Which tells you these were not sealed-off populations sitting still in their own quiet corners. They moved. Across enormous distances, over enormous stretches of time, back and forth along the spine of a continent. Now let me put the arithmetic in front of you, gently, because the arithmetic is the loudest thing in this part of the story. At the time Denny was read, the number of ancient genomes ever recovered from Neanderthals and Denisovans put together was tiny. A couple of dozen. That was the entire sample. every genome we had from either people, anywhere in the world, across hundreds of thousands of years, and it would have fitted comfortably around one long dinner table, and one of them was a first-generation child of both. Think for a moment about what that actually requires. Suppose that mixing between these peoples had been rare, a genuine once-in-an-age event. Then the chance of it turning up inside a sample that's small is close to nothing at all. You would not find it. Nobody would ever find it. For it to show up at all, the mixing has to have been ordinary, not constant, and not everywhere, and I am not going to overstate it for you. But wherever the two peoples shared a landscape, they met. They lived alongside one another, and they had children together, and those children were carried and fed and raised. Often enough that a sample of a couple of dozen catches one of them. That is what the number is quietly telling you, and it is a very small number saying an extremely large thing. And it changes what that Altai Cave is. You have been picturing it, I suspect, as a shelter that different peoples used strictly in turn. Denisovans, then Neanderthals, then us, each taking a turn at the same good address, politely separated from one another by thousands of years of dirt. That is certainly how the layers read from the outside. But Denny says the turns overlapped. At least sometimes, in that one valley, both peoples were there at once, close enough to know each other, close enough to become each other. Let that settle for a moment, and let your breathing settle along with it. Somewhere in that cave, or in a camp along the river below it, there was a household. In that household the two lineages sat by the same fire and shared the same food, and nothing whatsoever about that was remarkable to the people sitting in it. It was a Tuesday. It was simply their life, going along at its own unhurried pace. Then everything went quiet for 90,000 years, until somebody at a long table with good light picked up a splinter the size of a matchstick and asked what it was. Which is where the question underneath all of this comes around again. And this time it is not abstract in the slightest, because it has a face on it now, or at least a family. We still have almost nothing of these people. A fingertip, a few teeth, a jaw from the roof of the world, and a splinter of a girl who belonged to both sides of the family tree at once. Whole continents of range, and a handful of pieces you could carry home in a coat pocket. So how does a kind of human disappear as completely as that? Here is the part I have been keeping from you. They did not disappear completely, and Denny is your first real clue as to how that can possibly be true. Because if a Neanderthal and a Denisovan could have a daughter together, then a Denisovan and one of us could have a daughter too. And if that is so, then somewhere out beyond that valley, in people breathing quietly at this very moment, the inheritance never stopped. It is in living bodies. It is measurable. You can go and look for it, and people did go and look for it, and they found it. That is where we are going next. Stay warm and stay easy, and let your hands go soft. The rest of this is the good part. So the two of them met, and a child came of that meeting. One girl. One splinter of bone. For a while, a single child could still be read as an accident of history, a chance meeting in one valley in one season, a story that began and ended inside a single family. It did not end there. Here is where this long puzzle turns, and turns toward you. A cave is no longer the only place to look for these people. Neither is a tooth, or another fragment of finger lying in a frozen floor, waiting for someone to notice it at last. The Denisovans can be found inside living human beings, in people who woke this morning, in people walking to work right now, carrying shopping, waiting for a kettle to boil. A people we can barely see in the ground are alive and quietly at work inside people you could pass on any street. Sit with how strange that is for a moment. We have almost no bones of them, and we have their whole genome, and a genome, once you have it, is a key. Every living person becomes a door that can be opened. Let me show you how that key is turned, because it is gentler work than it sounds. Scientists took the code read out of the finger bone in the Altai, and then they laid it quietly beside the codes of living people from all around the world. Now, most of your DNA looks like most of everybody's DNA. That is the first and best fact in all of human genetics. You are very nearly identical, letter for letter, to any stranger in the world. But here and there, in some people, a stretch stands out from the rest. It is a little too different from the ordinary human pattern, and it sits a little too close to the Denisovan pattern to be chance. Those stretches do not lie scattered about like dust. They arrive in blocks, long unbroken runs of code, sitting inside a modern chromosome like a paragraph written in another hand. That blockiness is the whole giveaway. Every generation, the code you pass on to your children is shuffled and cut and dealt out again. A borrowed stretch is broken a little shorter each time that it is dealt, so the length of the block becomes a kind of clock. Long blocks mean the mixing was recent. Short blocks mean it happened very long ago indeed. Measure the blocks carefully, and a date can be put on a meeting that nobody ever wrote down. I would like you to hold that for a second before we go on, because it is quietly astonishing. Nobody kept a record of these meetings. There was no writing then, no calendar, and no name for the year. Every person who could have told you about it has been gone for tens of thousands of years, and their language went into the ground with them, and yet the meeting was written down anyway, by nobody, in the only ink that never fades. It went into the bodies of the children. Those bodies made more bodies, and the sentence was copied forward faithfully all the way into someone alive today who has no idea that they are carrying it. And when they counted, the map that came back surprised almost everyone. The strongest signal anywhere on Earth is nowhere near Siberia. It lies thousands of kilometers away, out in the warm Pacific and in the islands below Asia. In New Guinea, in the islands of Melanesia, and in Aboriginal Australia, in the genomes of people living there right now, this ancient thread runs to something like 3 to 5% of the whole. In some measurements, a little more than that. Think for a moment about what such a number really means. Out of every 100 pages of the book, 3 or 4 or 5 of them were written in that other hand. And you would never know it by looking. That is the part I want you to sit with. There is nothing to see. No mark, no feature, no sign in a face or a hand that any eye could ever pick out. The people carrying the largest share of this inheritance look exactly like what they are, which is people. Fishermen and farmers, teachers and grandmothers, children running for a bus in the heat of the afternoon. If you stood beside one of them in a market, you would notice nothing whatsoever, because there is nothing there to notice. The whole of it is folded away out of sight, in a place you cannot look into without a laboratory. I want to be careful with you here, because this is the exact place where a story like this one can go wrong. This is not a ranking, it is not a ladder, and it never was one. No one alive is more human than you are, and you are not more human than anyone. There is no such thing as more human. This ancestry is not a mark of anything at all, in either direction. It is simply a record of where somebody's ancestors happened to walk many thousands of years back and who they happened to meet along the road. Every living person is a braid, and so are you. Every single one, without exception. The only difference between any of us is which threads went into the weaving, and no thread is finer than another. Follow that thread north and west from the islands, and it thins, but it does not disappear. Across East Asia and across South Asia, the very same borrowed blocks turn up in smaller quantities, often a fraction of 1%. It sounds like nothing at all, put that way. It is not nothing. A fraction of 1% spread across some of the largest populations on Earth adds up to a very great many people. Hundreds of millions of them, carrying a few quiet sentences of that old code, going about entirely ordinary lives and never once suspecting it. You can measure the thinning itself, and the thinning tells its own story. In general, the further a population lives from the islands of the southwest Pacific, the less of this inheritance you find in it. That is exactly what a spreading trace looks like once it has been diluted, generation after generation, by people who did not carry it. So the pattern is not random noise. It has a direction, and a source, and a slope to it, like the shallow edge of something that was once far deeper. Follow that slope back up toward the deep end, and you are being pointed at a meeting, somewhere out east and south, long before anybody thought to draw a map of it. And people whose ancestry lies wholly within Africa carry little or none of this particular thread. Hold on to that carefully, because it is not a lack. Those same populations carry the deepest and richest variety in the whole human species, more of it than all the rest of the world put together. And there are hints in that code of ancient meetings of their own, with peoples we have not yet found and may never be able to name. Everybody's ancestry is braided, and that includes yours. The braids are simply woven from different threads. Now here is the detail that turned a curiosity into something very much larger. When the scientists looked closely at the borrowed blocks, they did not all match in the same way. The Denisovan code carried by people in New Guinea is not a close match for the girl from the Altai Cave. It is related to her, clearly and unmistakably, but distantly. Cousins, not sisters. Meanwhile, some of the code found on the Asian mainland sits noticeably nearer to that Altai genome. Different blocks, different distances, different clocks. Think about what it would take to produce a pattern like that. If every scrap of this inheritance had come from one single meeting, then every scrap of it would look alike wherever you found it. Copies of a copy of the same page. That is not what you find at all. You find pages that plainly came out of the same book, and just as plainly came from different editions of it. Some sit close to the Altai text, others sit a long way off from it, and a long way off from each other. Those differences are far too large to have grown up in the time available since. Read the pattern carefully, and only one explanation survives. There was not one mixing, there were several. At least 2 separate Denisovan populations met our ancestors, and quite possibly 3. Different groups in different places at different times spread across many thousands of years. Groups that had been apart from one another so long that their own codes had drifted well away from each other. Let that settle, because it quietly rewrites everything you have been picturing. This was never one small band in one Siberian cave, meeting one wandering family of ours, once, by luck. This was a people, spread wide across a continent, divided into branches that had grown distinct from one another, living in Siberian cold and in island heat and on high ground, all at the same time. And our own ancestors ran into them again and again and again. Picture that from above if you can. A map with no borders drawn on it yet. Two kinds of human being moving slowly through the same enormous landscape for tens of thousands of years. Sometimes they miss each other entirely. Sometimes one single valley holds both of them, and every so often two groups come face to face by a river or at the mouth of a shelter, and something in that meeting goes gently rather than badly. Families join, children are born. And those children grow up and have children of their own, and the thread is carried forward, quietly, into people who are alive today. That is the astonishing thing about the DNA in your body, and in everybody's. It does not care in the least about being remembered. It simply keeps going. It carries the record of meetings that nobody survived to describe across 100,000 years of forgetting in perfect working order. And all of that only sharpens the thing we still cannot explain. A people that widespread should be easy to find. A people spread from Siberia out to the far islands should have left bones in every layer, in every country, in every museum drawer in the world. Instead we have a finger, a jaw, a handful of teeth, read everywhere, and seen almost nowhere. So how does a people that large leave a trace that small? And why, if they are gone, is so much of them still here? Keep a firm hold of that question, because the first real piece of the answer is about to arrive. And it arrives of all the places in the world on the roof of it, in the lungs and the blood of people living now. Come up with me then, to a height where the air itself is different. You are standing on the Tibetan Plateau, and the ground beneath your boots is above 4,000 meters. It is a vast, pale, open country, higher than almost anywhere that people have ever chosen to live. The sky is an impossible blue, and it feels close enough to lean against. There is grass, and there are grazing herds, and low stone houses, and prayer flags shifting in a cold wind. Somewhere out of sight a dog is barking, and the sound carries an extraordinary distance in air this clean. It is beautiful in a way that goes straight through the chest. And if you have come up from sea level, your body has already begun to complain. The air here holds far less oxygen in every breath you take, roughly a third less than the air down at sea level. Your heart notices first. It quickens. The breathing deepens, and then it deepens again. A slow ache settles in behind your eyes and stays there. You climb a short flight of steps and have to stand still at the top of them. Nothing is wrong with you. The body is simply doing arithmetic and finding that the sum does not work. Stay a few weeks up here and you would begin to adjust, the way that any visitor does. The body reaches for the obvious repair, which is to make more red cells, more carriers to move what little oxygen there is. That answer works well enough for a season. It works much less well as a way to live an entire life. Blood that grows too thick is harder work to push around a body, and the heart is the one that has to do the pushing. People who spend whole lifetimes very high up can suffer for it, and the trouble is well known to the doctors who work at altitude. So the plateau has always asked a hard question of any body that decides to stay. The people who live there answered that question a very long time ago, not with equipment and not with technique, with biology. Here is the part that ought to make you sit up. Tibetan bodies do not thicken the blood the way that a visitor's would. Their oxygen carriers stay close to the ordinary sea level mark, and yet the oxygen still arrives where it is needed. They breathe a little differently. Their vessels open a little wider, they work and carry loads, and walk uphill in air that would leave a visitor sitting down on a step. Mothers carry pregnancies at that height with far less difficulty, and babies are born at healthier weights. It is not toughness. Toughness is a thing that you do. This is a thing that a body simply is. So the geneticists went looking for the reason, and I would like you to follow the logic with me, because it is beautifully simple. They compared the code of people living high on the plateau with the code of their relatives living low, down in the valleys and the lowland cities. Most of it, as you would expect, was the same. Then one small region lit up like a lamp. It carries a plain, unlovely laboratory name, EPAS1. Do not worry about the letters, and worry about the job instead. This little stretch of code helps to run the body's oxygen sense. You are carrying it yourself, by the way, and so is everybody. It is part of the switchboard that notices when the air has gone thin and decides what ought to be done about it. It is the very control that tells your marrow to make more red cells when you climb. And high on the plateau, almost everybody carries a version of it that turns that instruction down, not off, down gently and permanently, for a whole lifetime. That version is carried by the great majority of people living high in Tibet, and almost nowhere else in the world is it common. So when the researchers went looking for where such an unusual version could possibly have come from, they found something that stopped them where they stood. It did not look like any other living human version of that code. It looked like the girl in the cave. It matched the Denisovan genome. Read that once more, slowly, because it is one of the most remarkable sentences this science has ever produced. A people who left us a finger bone and a jaw are the reason that a living child can run uphill at 4,000 meters without her heart labouring. A vanished branch of humanity is still, this morning, keeping people well. And it is doing that in the very country where their own jawbone was found, high on the same plateau where you are standing now. They were up there. Of course they were up there. They had been up there long enough to be shaped by it. There is a tidiness to that which I do not think anybody expected. The two halves of this story were found by completely different means, years apart, by people who were not looking for one another at all. One team was reading a jawbone, another was reading the blood of the living. And the two readings turned out to be describing the same neighbourhood, at the same altitude, under the same thin sky. When two entirely separate lines of evidence walk into the same room like that, you are usually looking at something true. It is one of the quiet pleasures of this work, and one of the rarer ones. Now let me show you how a borrowed piece of code actually spreads through a people, because it is far quieter than you would ever guess. When two peoples mix, the children carry a mosaic of both of them, in just the way that you carry a mosaic of your own two parents. Most of the borrowed pieces do nothing very much in particular. Some are a slight nuisance in the new body, and those get whittled away across the generations, quietly and without any ceremony at all. But every so often, a borrowed piece lands in a place where it happens to be exactly locally useful. And then something patient begins. A family carrying that piece does very slightly better on the high ground. Not dramatically. Nobody notices, and nobody could have noticed. You could have stood there and watched for a whole lifetime and seen nothing happening at all. Their mothers come through pregnancies a little more easily, and a few more of their children grow up strong enough to have children of their own. That is the entire mechanism. That is all that it has ever been. There is no struggle in it, and there is no winner. Only a faint advantage, handed down again and again through hundreds of unremarkable lifetimes. Give a faint advantage enough time, though, and it becomes everybody. Slowly the peace rises through the population. 10 people in 100. Then 30. Then most of them. Then very nearly all. And one day it is simply what the people of that place are like. And nobody living remembers that it was ever borrowed from anyone. It is one of the fastest such rises we have ever measured in human beings. The plateau asked its hard question, and the answer was already sitting there inside the code, waiting, handed over long before by somebody else. I want you to notice the shape of that, because it matters. Nothing in this was aimed at anything. The Denisovans did not carry that piece of code in order to give it away, and they had no idea that they had it. Your own distant ancestors did not go looking for it, and could not have recognized it if they had. It was handed over the way a coat gets left behind in a house, without ceremony, and without a word said about it. And then a very great deal of time went by, and the weather changed, and one day somebody needed a coat. That is not a story about winners at all. It is a story about luck and patience and the sheer length of the past. Altitude is the clearest of these gifts, but it is not the only one. Look at the immune system and you find the same fingerprints again. Several of the regions that help your body to recognize an infection and to decide how hard it ought to fight carry this same ancient inheritance in people across Asia and out into the Pacific. That makes a great deal of sense once you stop and think about it. A people who had lived in a place for hundreds of thousands of years had already met whatever else lived there. Their bodies had learnt the local dangers the long and costly way. Our ancestors, arriving new, were quietly handed a set of answers they had not had to work out for themselves. Think of it as arriving in an unfamiliar country and being met at the door by somebody who already knows the roads. You are told nothing. Nobody explains a thing to you. You simply find, without ever quite understanding why, that you take the right turning rather more often than a stranger should. That is roughly what an inherited immune variant does inside a body. It is not wisdom, and it is not memory. It is only the shape of an old solution, kept on because it kept on working. There is a hint of the same story far to the north as well. Among peoples living in the Arctic, one region of code that helps to govern how a body handles fat and cold appears to carry that old signature too. The evidence there is younger and more careful than the altitude case, so I will not press it further than it will go. But the shape of it is the same shape. A vanished people, still quietly useful, in a climate that asks a great deal of anybody living in it. So look at what you and I are holding now. It is not much at all, and it is everything. A finger, a jaw, a handful of teeth, and a genome that is still, at this very hour, doing real work inside the bodies of living people. Helping a woman carry a child at height. Helping an immune system read a threat correctly, threaded invisibly through hundreds of millions of perfectly ordinary days. And that is where the word we began with starts to come apart in our hands. Vanished. It is such a final word. It sounds like an ending, and an ending is what you expect from a story about a kind of human being who is no longer here. But a people who are still keeping other people well have not exactly ended. Not in the way that stones end, or fires end, or languages end. Something else happened to them, and it is something you and I have been walking slowly towards since the very first minute of this. Which brings us back at last to the question we have carried the whole way. If they are here, in this quiet, working, invisible fashion, then where did the rest of them go? What became of the people themselves? the ones who lit fires in that cave, and climbed that plateau, and looked out over that impossible blue? The answer is close now, and I do not think it is the answer you have been bracing yourself for. There is no catastrophe waiting at the end of this. There is no single terrible night. What is waiting is quieter than that, and stranger, and in the end far kinder to hold. We are one turn away from it now. Stay with me. So we come back one last time to the thing we have not yet explained. You have been carrying it since the first quiet minutes of tonight. A finger bone in a cave in the Altai. A people we can read and cannot see. And underneath all of it, the question that would not sit still. How does an entire kind of human vanish so completely that almost nothing is left of them but their genes? Here is the answer. I want to hand it to you plainly, without any drum roll, because the truth is quieter than the question ever was. They were absorbed. That is the resolution. Not one terrible day. Not a single event you could mark on a map with a pin. The Denisovans did not end the way a story ends, with a last page and a closing line. They ended the way a small river ends when it joins a larger one. The water does not stop. It stops being separate. I think we expect catastrophes because catastrophes are the shape stories come in. Something arrives, something falls, and there is a date to point to afterward. Nothing about the Denisovans works that way, and the longer you sit with what we actually have, the less room there is for a single blow of any kind. There is no layer of ruin in the ground. There is no line in the genome where everything changes at once. What there is instead is a slow set of pressures. None of them is dramatic on its own. All of them lean in the same direction, across a stretch of time so long that you could live 100 lives inside it and notice nothing happening at all. Everything I am going to tell you for the next while is really just that one sentence, unfolded slowly. There are 3 strands inside it, and they lean on one another. Thin numbers. A restless climate. And meeting. Take any one of them on its own and it explains almost nothing. Braid all 3 together across tens of thousands of years, and you have the whole soft answer. Start with the numbers, because they matter far more than anything dramatic. The Denisovans were never many. That is not a judgment about them, and it is not a weakness in them. It is simply what their genome says when you read it carefully. A population leaves a signature in its own DNA. When a great many people are having children with a great many other people, the sequences drift apart from one another, and diversity piles up over the generations. When only a few are meeting, the sequences stay close and similar. The Denisovan sequence is a close and similar one. Their diversity is low. Read gently. That is the fingerprint of a people who were always thin on the ground. There is a limit to that reading, and it is worth knowing where it sits, because a resolution built on overstatement is no resolution at all. What a genome gives is not a head count, but a long-run average. It measures how many people were genuinely passing their inheritance forward, generation after generation, across many thousands of years. It cannot say how many were alive in any particular winter, and it cannot point to the crowded seasons or the empty ones. What it can tell you, and tells you firmly, is that the number was never large. Across the whole enormous sweep of country they moved through, there were never great masses of them anywhere, in any age we are able to reach. Held steady over hundreds of centuries, that single fact does more work in this story than any disaster could. So let the picture change in your mind. Set aside any image of a nation, or a crowd, or a territory with a border drawn around it. Think instead of small bands, a few dozen people moving together through a valley, then a long walk of days or weeks before you would meet the next band at all. And beyond them, more emptiness, and then perhaps another handful of families in another valley entirely. Now stretch that thin scattering across the range you already know they had. Siberia in the north, the high cold plateau in the middle, the warm forests of the far southeast. That is a spread nobody could walk across in a lifetime. And the whole of it, as far as we can tell, was held by a people you could have gathered into one modern town. Thin populations live differently. Not worse. Differently, everything for them turns on continuity, on the small band in the next valley, still being there when you go looking for it. A run of hard decades comes, and a valley empties gently over a few generations as families move on toward better ground. In a crowded world, someone soon walks back in and fills it. In a thin world, nobody does. The valley simply stays quiet. It is worth understanding what a small band actually leans on, because it is a good deal more than company. The people in the next valley are where your children find partners. They are also where a way of making something gets remembered, when the one person who knew it best is gone. Knowledge in a world without writing lives in heads and in hands, and it travels by meeting. When the meetings thin out, everything that used to travel along them thins out too. A band can find itself holding fewer skills than its grandparents held, through no fault and no failing of its own. Thin populations lose things quietly, and they lose them long before they lose people. That is the first strand, and you can already feel how it works. Nothing violent in it at all, just arithmetic, running very slowly across a very large map. The second strand is the weather, and by weather I mean the whole long swing of the Ice Age. You are used to a climate that feels like a fixed thing, a background your life happens in front of. Theirs was not fixed. Across the tens of thousands of years the Denisovans were alive, the world cooled and warmed and cooled again, in long, slow pulses. Glaciers thickened in the mountains and then eased back. Forests marched north in the warm spells and retreated south in the cold ones. Grassland became woodland, and woodland became grassland again. Picture what that does to a scattered people. In a warm stretch the corridors open, the passes clear, the river valleys green, and bands that had not met for generations find one another again. Then the cold returns, the passes close, the good ground shrinks back into pockets, and each pocket holds its own small group, cut off from the rest by ice and distance and time. You can see that rhythm written into the floor of the cave itself, if you read the layers patiently enough. Occupation does not run through them like one unbroken thread. It comes and goes, thickening in some bands of sediment and fading almost to nothing in others. It reads as though the valley were used, and left, and then quietly found again by somebody new. That is what a shifting climate looks like from inside a single shelter. Not a story of endings. A long alternation of arrivals and departures, spread so thinly through time that a whole human lifetime would have registered as nothing at all. Isolation, then reconnection, then isolation again. Over and over, for longer than any of us can really hold in our heads. For a large population, that rhythm is survivable, because there are always enough people somewhere. For a thin one, every cold swing is a narrowing, and not every pocket comes through the narrowing with people still in it. Slowly across an enormous stretch of time, the map of them grows sparser, not by catastrophe, by subtraction, one quiet valley at a time. And then the third strand arrives, and it is the one that actually answers your question. Modern humans came east. That is the whole hinge of it. Our own ancestors spread out of Africa and moved across Asia, and they did not arrive as a thin scattering. They arrived in larger numbers, in wider networks, with more bands in contact with more bands. The two peoples moved into the same valleys and drank from the same rivers and sheltered under the same overhangs. They met. You already know they met, because you have seen what came of it. You have heard where their inheritance sits in living people today, and how many separate meetings the pattern quietly implies. You have heard what one handed-down stretch of it does on the high plateau, in bodies that take thin air without struggling. None of that could exist if the two peoples had only passed each other at a distance. So here is the ordinary human thing that happened, and I want to say it warmly, because it deserves warmth. There were children, generation after generation, in place after place. There were children with parents from both peoples, and families formed around them, and bands took people in the way bands always have. What we read in a laboratory as a signal in a genome was at the time simply somebody's daughter and somebody's grandson, and a life going on in the usual way. Now put the arithmetic back on top of that. When a thin population keeps having children with a much larger one, the direction of travel is only ever one way. The Denisovan line does not stop, it spreads out. It thins into the bigger pool, generation after generation. In the end, there is no band left anywhere that is only Denisovan, and no cave anywhere with only their kind of people in it. Their inheritance is still there, it is just distributed now, carried in pieces by many, instead of held whole by a few. And notice that this runs one way for reasons that have nothing to do with worth, which is the part that surprises people. It is not that one group was stronger, or better made, or better suited to the world. It is simply that when a small pool and a large pool keep mixing, the small one is the one that disperses. If you took 100 families and joined them to 10,000, and then let the generations run on quietly, you would find the same result at the end. Nobody would have had to lose anything at all. The pattern in living genomes points to this happening more than once, in more than one place, across a long stretch of time. That is exactly what you would expect if it were ordinary life rather than a single dramatic hinge in history. That is absorption. It is not a defeat, and it is not a disappearance in the way you first imagined. A people can be taken up into another people and still be entirely present in them. I want to be honest with you about the limits here, because honesty is part of what makes this restful. We do not know the tone of those meetings. We have no scenes. We cannot tell you whether a particular encounter was welcoming or wary or simply practical, and anyone who tells you otherwise is filling in a blank with their own imagination. What we have is the outcome, written into living bodies. And the outcome is children, and grandchildren, and a line that continues, which leaves one word doing far too much work. Extinct. We use that word as though it means erased, gone, finished, the door closed. It is a word that strains the moment you set it against what we actually found. But for the Denisovans it means something much narrower and much stranger. It means there is no longer a separate group of people who are only them. Their branch stopped being a branch. It joined the trunk. The line itself never ended. If it had ended, there would be nothing to find in you or in anybody else, and there would be no story tonight at all. Instead, their branch runs into ours and keeps going under a different name. There is something in that I keep turning over. Somewhere out there, in a valley we will almost certainly never identify, there was a last generation of people who could have been called Denisovan and nothing else. They did not know it. Nobody standing beside them knew it either. There was no moment that felt like an ending to any of them, because from the inside it was only ever an ordinary run of years with children in it. Endings of this kind never announce themselves, and you would not have felt one arrive. They are visible only from a very long way away. That is precisely where you and I happen to be sitting tonight, with the whole slow shape of it laid out in front of us. That is the difference the whole mystery turns on, and it is worth holding still for a moment. A species can disappear and still persist. Those two things sound as though they cancel each other out. They do not. One of them is about categories and boundaries and the names we draw around groups. The other is about inheritance, which pays no attention to any of that. And once you see it that way, the strangeness sitting under this whole story finally comes apart in your hands. Ask why there are so few bones. Because there were never many of them, spread across a continent, and because bone survives only in rare and lucky places. A cool cave, the right chemistry in the floor, a body that came to rest exactly where the ground would keep it. Multiply a thin population by a small chance of preservation across an area that vast, and a scatter of teeth and fragments is not a puzzle at all. It is what you should expect. Then ask why there is so much of their DNA. Because absorption does not write into stone, it writes into people. Every generation copies it forward and hands it on in living bodies, which is a far better archive than any cave floor has ever been. So they are hard to see for exactly the same reason they are easy to read. Both facts come out of the same quiet answer. They were few, and they were taken in. That is the mystery resolved. The finger bone, the empty shelf where their skeletons should be, the genes alive in people walking around this evening. One explanation underneath all three. And it leaves us somewhere I did not expect when we started, which is why I want to stay here a little while with you, unhurried, before the night closes. Most of us were taught the wrong shape for this. You probably remember the picture, even if you cannot remember where you first saw it. A row of figures walking left to right across the page, stooped at one end, upright at the other. Each one taller and straighter than the last, each one replacing the one before it. That picture is a ladder. It is tidy, and it is comforting, and it is wrong. What the Denisovans show you is a braid. Strands running alongside each other for a very long time. Sometimes far apart, sometimes close enough to touch, sometimes crossing and twisting together and running on afterward as one thicker strand. Us in one place, Neanderthals in another, Denisovans across an enormous eastern range. And other lineages besides, some of which we have only glimpsed, and some of which we have surely not glimpsed at all. There was never a single file. There was a family, spread out and moving, meeting itself again at intervals across the map. Your own ancestry runs back into that braid and does not come out the other side as one clean line. It comes out as several, gathered up. The ladder was always a flattering picture, and that is probably why it lasted so long. It set us at the top of a climb, with everybody else arranged neatly below as steps we had already taken. The braid gives you something better than flattery. It gives you company. It says that for most of the time there have been humans on this earth, there was more than one kind of us at once. They shared the same valleys and the same cold, and often enough the very same shelter. And the reason only one kind is here now is not that the others were failures. The strands simply ran together, which changes what the people in that cave are to you. They are not a footnote. They are not a rough draft of something better. They are not a lower rung on anybody's ladder. I would ask you to set that idea down for good, because it was never true of them, and it has never been true of any group of people since. They are relatives, in the plain, ordinary sense of the word. You have already heard how many kinds of people pass through that one cave in the Altai across the long run of its use, and how their traces lie stacked in the same patient ground. Set beside everything else, that is a family fact more than an archaeological one. 3 kinds of human, at different times, choosing the same slope above the same river, and all for the same simple reasons, because it was dry, because it faced the right way, because the water was close. You would have chosen it too. Think about what all of this actually means for the girl whose fingertips started it. She was somebody's child. She lived in a valley with a river in it, under a sky with the same stars you can see tonight. The cave she slept in had been sheltering people for longer than she could possibly have known. She had a life, and a family, and a name that was spoken by people who loved her, and that we will never recover. We know her by a bone the size of a grain of rice, and by the whole shape of her people read out of it. That is a remarkable thing to be able to say. It is also, if you sit with it, an oddly tender one. There is a great deal we will never have of them, and it is worth naming plainly, because a resolution should not pretend to be larger than it is. You will never hear what their language sounded like, or know whether they had one shaped anything like ours. You will not learn what they said to each other through a long winter, or what they found funny, or which of them the others went to when something needed mending. None of that fossilized, and none of it copied forward into your inheritance or into anybody else's. What survived is the fact of them, and the fabric of them, and the quietly astonishing detail that they are not finished. For a people this hard to see, that is a great deal to have been left with, and here is the part I find hardest to put down at the end of a night like this. Somewhere, right now, while you are lying still and this is playing, that inheritance is at work. In someone asleep in a house on a high mountain road, in air far thinner than the air in your room, a body is handling that thin air easily. It manages it because of something handed down from a people who had no name at all until recently. In someone else, an immune system is meeting the world with instructions written a very long way back. And it is not only in the high places. Pieces of that inheritance sit in people going about entirely ordinary evenings, in the same hours as your own, across the eastern half of the world. They are there in cities that did not exist when any of this was settled, doing small, unglamorous work inside cells that will never once be thought about by the person carrying them. There is no ceremony in it, no memory attached. A stretch of instructions was handed forward along an unbroken chain of parents and children. It came from a valley in the Altai, or somewhere south of it, all the way into a body that is breathing slowly in a dark room at this very moment, much as you are. None of those people are thinking about it. That is rather the point. It does not need to be remembered in order to keep working. It simply goes on quietly, in the background of ordinary lives, in bodies that are washing dishes and catching trains and sleeping through the night, the way you are settling into sleep now. A people vanished, and their work did not. I like that the name came so late. For tens of thousands of years there was nobody to call them anything at all. Then a cave in the Altai gave them one, and a child's fingertip carried an entire kind of human back into the language. Most of history is louder than that. You would have to look a long way to find a quieter arrival. Almost none of it is so gentle. So let the valley come back one more time, and let it come slowly. You are standing at the mouth of the cave again, high on the slope above the river, where the whole of this began. The light is going. Below you the water runs on under a skin of ice, the way it has run for 100,000 winters. The mountains stand around the valley, patient and dark, holding the last grey light along their ridges. The cold comes up out of the dark behind you. It always did. Behind that cold, the floor of the cave goes down through its layers, ash over ash, bone over bone. Their fires, and then other people's fires, and then ours, laid one upon another so gently that it took us all this time to learn how to read them. There is nothing left to solve now. The question that opened tonight has been answered, and it can rest where it is. Somewhere down in that ground a small bone waited through tens of thousands of years and was found, and it turned out to hold a whole people inside it. The wind moves once along the ridge and settles. Snow comes into the valley, slow and soundless, the way it has always come. It lies on the rocks above the entrance. It gathers softly in the hollows of the old path. The river keeps going, quiet under the ice. The cave mouth stands open to the dark, the way it stood then. The mountains hold still around it. The stars come out slowly over the ridge and turn and go on turning. And the long night settles over the Altai and holds and grows quiet and stays.